She was trembling in pain, not the kind that fades with a deep breath, but the kind that settles into the bones and makes time feel cruelly slow. And yet he still didn't stop, because stopping now would mean surrendering to fear, and fear had already taken too much from them. The room was dim, filled with the sound of uneven breathing and the low hum of an old generator that flickered like their hope, weak but stubbornly alive. Her hands clutched the edge of the worn mattress, knuckles pale, lips pressed tight to keep from crying out, not because she wasn't hurting, but because she didn't want him to see just how afraid she was. He stood beside her, sweat running down his forehead, his hands shaking even more than hers, though he tried desperately to appear strong. Every part of him wanted to stop, to beg forgiveness, to say they should wait. But the truth was merciless. There was no waiting left. Outside, rain battered the tin roof like a warning, and the world beyond those thin walls felt vast and uncaring. They had been turned away from help earlier that day. No power, no staff, no resources. Come back tomorrow, they were told, as if tomorrow was guaranteed. But tonight, her pain had sharpened, her body making the decision for them. He remembered the promise he made months ago, when fear was still distant and the future felt possible. He had promised not to run, not to freeze, not to let circumstances decide their fate. Now that promise stood between them like a silent oath. She looked at him then, eyes glassy but steady, and whispered his name, not in accusation but in trust. That was what broke him the most. Trust is heavy when lives depend on it. His voice cracked as he spoke to her softly, reminding her to breathe, reminding her she wasn't alone, even as doubt screamed in his own mind. Every second felt stretched, every sound too loud, every movement too slow. He followed what little knowledge he had, guided more by instinct and love than skill, praying silently that it would be enough. The pain surged again, stronger this time, and she cried out despite herself, her body trembling uncontrollably. He almost stopped then, almost. But something deeper than fear took over, something ancient and unyielding. This was not about courage anymore. It was about refusing to let despair win. And then, in the middle of the chaos, in the very moment when everything seemed on the verge of breaking, something changed. The room felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Her trembling shifted, no longer just pain, but effort, purpose. His hand steadied, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might drown out the storm outside. And then there it was, a sound so small, so fragile, yet powerful enough to silence fear entirely. A cry, thin, shaky, but unmistakably alive. He froze, tears blurring his vision as the reality crashed over him. Against all odds in that dim room, surrounded by uncertainty and fear, a new life had begun. She collapsed back exhausted, tears streaming freely now, not from pain, but from relief so intense it hurt. He laughed and cried at the same time, his hands trembling as he held the tiny, warm proof that hope had not abandoned them. The storm outside continued, the world unchanged, but inside that room, everything had shifted forever. When the crying softened into quiet breaths, reality returned slowly like dawn after a sleepless night. And with it came the weight of what they had survived. She lay still, eyes closed, her chest rising and falling as if each breath was a small victory, while he sat beside her, afraid to move, afraid that even a single wrong motion might undo the miracle cradled in his arms. The child was impossibly small, fingers curling instinctively, unaware of the fear, pain, and determination that had brought them into the world. He studied that tiny face, searching for answers to questions he didn't yet know how to ask. How do you protect something so fragile in a world so unforgiving? How do you teach hope when you've lived with fear? She opened her eyes then and reached out weakly, her touch light but grounding, reminding him that they were still here together. No words were needed. Everything they felt passed silently between them, gratitude, exhaustion, disbelief, and a fierce, unspoken promise. Outside, the rain began to ease, as if the night itself had decided to show mercy. He thought about all the moments that had led here, the choices, the sacrifices, the times they almost gave up. None of it felt wasted now. Pain had not been meaningless. Fear had not been victorious. This new life was proof that even in the darkest moments, something beautiful can still begin. As the hours passed, light crept slowly through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the room in soft gold. Morning arrived not with celebration, but with quiet understanding. Their lives would not suddenly become easy. Challenges still waited beyond that door. Money, safety, uncertainty, but something fundamental had changed. They were no longer just surviving. They were responsible for a future. He gently placed the child beside her, watching as instinct took over. As connection formed without effort or instruction, in that moment, he understood something he had never fully grasped before. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. She smiled faintly, eyes shining, and whispered that the pain had been worth it. He shook his head, tears falling again, knowing there were no words big enough to describe what she had endured. As the sun rose higher, the world outside slowly woke, unaware that in a forgotten room, a quiet miracle had taken place. A life had begun not in comfort, but in courage, not in safety, but in love. And as he looked at the two of them, exhausted, fragile, yet unbroken, he realized this story was bigger than a single night. It was about resilience, about choosing hope when surrender feels easier, about the moments that define us when no one is watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even pain can give birth to purpose, then stay connected with this channel. There are many more stories like this, stories of struggle, strength, and unexpected beginnings waiting to be told. Days passed, measured not by clocks but by breaths, feedings, and the quiet rhythm of survival. And with each sunrise, the weight of responsibility grew heavier, yet somehow easier to carry. The pain she had endured lingered in her body like a fading echo, but her eyes held a new steadiness now, one shaped by love rather than fear. He learned quickly that exhaustion does not disappear when miracles happen. It simply changes form. Nights blurred into mornings as the child cried softly, demanding warmth, presence, reassurance that this world, so harsh at the edges, would still respond with care. He found himself awake more than asleep, listening, watching, learning the language of small movements and subtle sounds. Every tiny breath felt precious, every quiet moment a victory. There were moments when doubt returned, creeping in during the darkest hours before dawn, whispering questions about the future they could not yet answer. What kind of life could they offer? What kind of world awaited this fragile beginning? But then the child would curl their fingers around his, grounding him in the present, reminding him that the future is not built all at once, but moment by moment. She watched him from across the room sometimes, seeing how the fear that once ruled his movements had softened into something stronger, determination. They spoke little about that night, not because they wanted to forget it, but because words felt too small for something so defining. Instead, they spoke through actions, shared glances, silent understanding, the way they moved around each other with care, as if protecting not just the child, but the memory of what they had survived together. Outside, life continued indifferent and loud, but inside their small space, something sacred had taken root. Help came slowly, first a neighbor, then quiet support, then a sense that they were no longer invisible. Each small kindness felt amplified after what they had endured. He realized then that strength often attracts strength, that courage once shown invites others to step forward. As weeks passed, the child grew calmer, stronger, and with that growth came a fragile but undeniable hope. The trembling pain of that night transformed into a story they would one day tell, not as suffering alone, but as proof that even when everything seems unbearable, persistence can open the door to new beginnings. She sometimes placed her hand over the child's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat, and smiled through tears, knowing that life had chosen to stay. He began to understand that stopping would have been easier, but continuing had changed everything. This was no longer just their story. It was a reminder that moments of endurance shape destinies. And for everyone listening, watching, or feeling the weight of their own struggles, this story stands as a quiet message. You are stronger than the moment that tries to break you. If this journey touched your heart, if stories of resilience and hope matter to you, then stay connected with this channel, because there are many more powerful stories waiting, stories that remind us why we keep going, even when it hurts. Time moved forward in quiet, almost unnoticed steps, and with it came changes that once felt impossible to imagine. The small room that had witnessed fear and pain slowly transformed into a place of learning, patience and growth. Laughter, soft at first, uncertain, began to replace the silence that once pressed heavily against the walls. The child's presence reshaped everything, their priorities, their fears, even their understanding of themselves. She grew stronger day by day, not just in body but in spirit, carrying within her a resilience forged on that difficult night. He changed too in ways he hadn't expected. The man who once trembled at the thought of making the wrong decision now stood steadier, shaped by responsibility and love rather than doubt. They faced setbacks, moments when old fears resurfaced, when resources felt thin and the future uncertain, but they no longer faced them alone or unprepared. That night, the one filled with trembling pain and relentless effort, had taught them something permanent. Stopping is not always safety, and continuing is not always cruelty. Sometimes continuing is an act of faith. As the child took their first unsteady steps, he remembered how close they had come to giving up, and the thought sent a chill through him. One decision, one moment of endurance, had rewritten their entire story. She often watched the child sleep, overwhelmed by the quiet truth that life does not always begin in ideal circumstances, but it always deserves a chance to grow. The world outside remained unpredictable, sometimes harsh, sometimes kind, but they had learned how to meet it with caution. Yes, but also with courage. Their story did not end with that night. It began there. Pain became memory, memory became meaning, and meaning became purpose. And for those listening to this story, there is something here worth holding on to. Your hardest moments do not define you by their pain, but by what you choose to do within them. If this final chapter resonated with you, if these moments of struggle, strength, and new beginnings spoke to your heart, then stay connected with this channel. More powerful stories await. Stories that remind us that even when the night feels endless, dawn still comes, and with it, the chance to begin again.